Nice Agfa Super Silette. Unlike the ones that you commonly see, and unlike the one that I own, because I've never got near one of these, this one has the f2 lens on it, which was a Solagon, I think. Yeah, Solagon, Agfa Solagon f2. Very nice. Nice camera, helical focusing, which makes it quite different from your run-of-the-mill Super Silettes. And the problem with this one is that the focus is very, very stiff. Apart from that, I'm sure it'll benefit from some servicing, but that's its headline problem. You would get a very sore finger trying to focus this camera while you're holding it up to your eye. So, got to get into this. How do you go about doing it? Well, this one's a mystery to me, and there is not much in the way of information on the net, unfortunately. What can I see? Well, opening the back of the camera, there are 3 holes here in the casting, and they look like they've got little leatherette patches in there, or plastic patches. Now underneath those I expect that I'll find 3 screws. And they'll be long screws, if I'm correct, and they'll pass through and fix into this casting at the front. And if I'm very lucky, that front casting will lift off without any further requirements from me. That's what I'm hoping for, because I want to take the shutter out so I can get access to this focus mechanism. And the shutter retaining ring is down there, tucked away behind this rectangular baffle. And that rectangular baffle, the restricted nature of it, prevents me from getting in any of my traditional retaining ring removing tools. So I'm going to have to approach this a different way, and I think if I can lift the whole front off the camera, the baffle will stay with the body of the camera. I'll have access to the retaining ring. At that stage I should have the helical mechanism all off the camera too. And if I'm very, very lucky, that's how you go about doing it. And it'll go very smoothly. But of course that remains to be seen. First up, I've got a dressmaking pin here, and I'm prying at this little patch because it's the easiest one to get to see if I can get under it and lift it up. It looks like it. That's very thin, whatever that is. There we go. That's the leatherette patch off, exposing the screw head. Well, now that I've succeeded with that one, I can have a go at the other 2, which are somewhat deeper in the recess and correspondingly awkward to get out. Of course, if I make a mess of those patches, it won't be the end of the world, because I'm sure I can use some other method to cover the screw heads. That one is not looking quite so happy, but it's coming out regardless. Okay, so there's my 3 screw heads exposed. Now I need to unscrew them. Will the screws come out without a fight? That's always the important question. That one is. Clear the slot in that screw because it's got remains of leatherette in it and adhesive, I think. That one's loose. we can have those two screws out. One other. I'm hoping, of course, that the rangefinder coupling and that the coupling for the cocking of the shutter are a simple arrangement and all this will lift off. But I've got the 3 screws out. Let's find out if I'm right. Yes, okay, so we have success. There's a little bit of sand and grit in here, but nothing too exciting. And likewise there's sand and grit in that helical. So that's the shutter release, obviously. The cocking action happens up here where the shaft on the camera body couples to it. Alright, so far so good. That went remarkably smoothly. This is the guidepost for our helical. I certainly want that shutter removed from there, and now I have access to the retaining ring here. So it shouldn't be too hard to put a tool across that. In fact, I've just done it with my tweezers. And unscrew that retaining ring. I will need to unsolder this flash connection here. That's the centre pin. And the earth side of it is clamped in here, so I can undo that screw and remove that wire. It may be easier to desolder it at this end on the shutter as I remove the shutter, so I'll leave that sitting in place for the moment and just unscrew that retaining ring. Right, well that retaining ring is a bit sticky, probably just with dust and dried grease. I'm just pushing it round there with one finger and the tip of this rule. Being very careful to keep away from the rear lens element. Okay, sounds like we're just about there. Okay, so there we have it. There's our retaining ring. This is all of a piece. This whole piece here is all one thing. That's like a probably forms part of the shroud mechanism, I would think. Okay, so let's see what happens. See if the shutter will pull through. Just to get that wire as free as I can get it through there. There's a shimmering on the back. Oh yeah, I can see the flash wire here. I've just pulled that piece of sleeving off. I can see that the flash wire is soldered at this point. So I'll just go and disconnect that. Well, as you can see, I've got that apart. There's another shimmering in here. And here's our shutter. I don't know if I can get this mask off here easily. I probably can once I remove my rear group. But I don't need to service the shutter immediately. The headline problem with this camera is that the helical is very sticky. Now if you look at that, you'll see that that's very filthy. You'll also see that there's a lot of sand in here. So this is somewhat of a mess. All this will need to come apart. And of course I've got to discover how I'm going to do that. That was our shutter release. I'll remove these pieces from the back of this because they're just sort of, they're in my way really. Let's pull that wire through. And put its sleeve to one side. Just pull them back out of the way. My shutter release. Well, this post is screwed into the mount by the looks of it, and this arm pivots on that post. So if I put something through there and twist it, it should unscrew. This piece here is just a bracket which keeps this contained. Basically it limits its travel. You can take that screw out because that's just held the earthing wire, and see if I can unscrew this post. It's got a slot in the top, so I should be able to engage my screwdriver. Right, there we go. These two screws. The neighbourhood lawn mowing has started, so my apologies for the noise. That can come out, and there's its return spring. Well, I was going to say there's its return spring, but it's jumped off. Which means now I've got to find it. No, that problem was all on my head. The return spring is here. It stayed on its post. Okay, so the helical here. This bracket here holds that tab in place. That effectively forces the inner to travel in a straight line inwards and outwards, not rotate. I'll take that bracket off. I think there's a retaining ring holding the outer helical in place here. I can see a notch here and one here. I would very much like to get those off. Get that ring off. This ring here looks like a retainer. I think if I take that off, I can get things apart. And likewise, if I don't take it off, I won't get things apart. Now, the alignment of my inner and outer helical, I'm going to mark those so that I've got them in some arrangement that I can recognise, so I can ensure that I get the two back together correctly. So what I normally do with things like that is choose some useful, simple method of doing it, like when the inner and outer helical are dead level with each other, then I'll scribe a line across them. I'll put a double line there, and that will guide me. It means that when I go to put it back together, I can be sure that I've started it in the right thread, because it'll be a multi-start thread. Well, I can remove the inner helical now, I think. This is very, very gummy. Okay, that gets that out of the picture. So now I've got my outer helical, which just revolves freely in the body, but there must be a stop here somewhere on the casting that prevents that rotating completely. So this retaining ring here I want off, and I'm probably going to have to make a span. I've got a lens spanner that will span that distance, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if I don't need a fair bit of solvent on here. Just given the stickiness of the grease, it won't need to be glued on there. That grease, if it's in a fine thread, that would be enough to glue that in there completely. So I'll find my lens spanner. Well, here I've got my lens spanner, and it looks like that thing has come loose without a fight. So I'll run it off just with the tip of a screwdriver. Oh, this is very sticky. So we'd be interested to note that I often go on about the dreaded Agfa green grease. This is not green, and it is not dried out to that concrete-like green grease rubbish that Agfa were famous for using. Oh, that's a very deep ring. Yeah, that's it. It's apart. So there we have our housing, our outer helical, and its retaining ring. And these parts I now need to clean quite thoroughly with naphtha to remove all traces of that old grease, of course, and the inner helical and the other various bits and pieces. Once I've got them all clean, I should be able to reassemble that part. Well, as you can see, I've got the retaining ring spinning on and off smoothly. The inner and outer helical move nice and freely relative to each other. So I've got rid of all that sticky old grease, all that sand and rubbish. I've got to do a final bit of cleaning to this stuff and then clean my work surface to get rid of all the grit that's fallen out of this, so that everything's nice and clean and there's no grit and sand and dust and rubbish to find its way back in when I reassemble this with some fresh lubricant. But so far, so good. I put my alignment marks on the back here so I'd know where the inner and outer helical fitted together. When they were in the correct alignment, when these surfaces were level with each other, that's where I put my marks across. Now I can see that I'm not the first person to be into this camera, because here I see someone else's alignment mark scratched in here, and another line scratched across here, though it's less clear what that one is aligned to, but this one here definitely was scratched across there, and it looks to me as if it's at the point where those two front surfaces are level. So someone's done a similar job in the past on this camera, or certainly they've had it apart down to this level. However, these parts are all clean now and just need to be assembled. So the inner and outer helical I've got them assembled together here. What I'll do is I'll back that helical most of the way back out, apply some helical grease in here, and I'll be using Helimax XP optical and instrument helical grease. It doesn't need lots and lots. If you clog the threads up with grease, it won't make it work smoother, but it will make it stiffer in its action. So with a rangefinder camera, the focus should be smooth. You don't want any rattles obviously, but it should be smooth. You should be able to move it easily with the tip of one finger while you hold the camera to your eye. A viewfinder camera is a different matter. With a viewfinder camera, there's some advantage in the focus being a little bit stiff because you're holding the camera down by your body, lining up your focus scale with your chosen mark. Then you're lifting the camera to your eye to take the photo. You do not want the focus being accidentally knocked in that process. With a rangefinder camera, that's not an issue because you're watching through the rangefinder the entire time. Anyway, lubrication. I'll start with the helical grease. So I'll just run that out most of the way. And put a few stripes of grease across here. This is quite a coarse helical thread. As such, it can probably take heavier grease without it becoming a serious problem. Just run that in. Work that backwards and forwards. That'll distribute itself across through the length of those threads. That's nice and smooth. It's certainly not rattling. I wouldn't want to put any more grease in there, that would stiffen it up. That's just quite good as it is. Now, getting this into the mount, around here, around this shiny piece of brass, that's where it fits into the body here. So I've made sure that's all clean and free from any grit and dust, and I don't want any stickiness there, so I'm just going to wipe this with a bit of molybdenum paste. Where that ring will contact. Now you see here there's a groove in the front piece here. Now that groove couples with a little pin that's visible right here, which limits the swing of the arm. And the molybdenum paste is, as the name suggests, it's almost dry. You're leaving virtually nothing on there. It's not inclined to get sticky. That feels good. Now I can put the retaining ring in place. Now the retaining ring, well, there's only the one edge there that comes up against the body that would benefit from anything in the way of lubrication, so I'm just going to rub some molybdenum paste on that. Doesn't need anything in the thread, of course. See if I can get this retaining ring started smoothly without any fights. That looks promising. Well, it's going on a lot easier than it came off. Now there's no adjustment for this. I think as far as I can tell it's designed to be tightened up hard against the shoulder, and that should set the clearance, which should be quite small. If it was to be an adjustment, you'd need some lock screw arrangement so that you would screw it down until you had it where you wanted it to be, and then the lock screw would be used to keep that adjustment. But this was just tightened up hard against the stop. That's that. Now I'll get that rotated where I can get my tool onto it easy enough. That's a good spot. I'll use my lens spanner to tighten that up. That's that. I'll just check the motion, that's good. Of course the helical's not moving because the inner helical's not being held in position. The inner helical needs to come around to this point where the bracket holds it. And so we'll need the bracket. Well, here's our bracket. And 2 screws pass through the casting to hold that in place. I can see that that's adjustable too, those holes are slotted. And I think for practical purposes that adjustment will help get the focus scale ring so that the infinity mark comes up where you'd expect it to. Now that's not sitting level there because there's so much slop in those screws. If that's not square, then the motion won't be smooth, it'll tend to jam. Where are we? Yeah, towards that end of the motion appears to be about where I'd want that. Check that that looks level. Let's tighten those 2 screws up and just check the action. Make sure that moves smoothly. There's our focus helical swinging in and out. So far so good. Well, I had a change of heart where I'd used the molybdenum paste between the focus scale ring and the body. It left a slight amount of rattle there, so I decided I would use something that was a bit more filling, and I used a bit of synthetic grease there instead, and that's certainly done the job. There's no hint of rattle there now at all. The action's still nice and smooth, of course. And so that's all ready there now. I need to put the shutter release lever and so forth back in here. And that part at least should go very smoothly indeed.